Norway, 955 years after Christ, the land of fjords and mountains finds itself gripped in a time of turmoil and ambition. This is an era where power is measured by the number of ships at your command and the warriors willing to die for your cause. The Norse kingdoms are fragmented, with local chieftains and would-be kings battling for supremacy over the valuable trading routes that weave through the dramatic Norwegian coastline. Our story takes us to the island of Frey, a seemingly modest piece of land nestled against the western coast of Norway. Yet this unassuming island would soon become the stage for one of the most decisive confrontations in Viking history. Surrounded by the cold, clear waters of the North Sea, Frey's strategic position made it a natural checkpoint for ships traveling along the coast. Imagine standing on the shores of Frey in the year 955. The salt-tinged wind carries the scent of pine from the mainland forests. The rugged landscape is dotted with small settlements where farmers tend their fields while keeping one eye on the horizon, ever watchful for the silhouettes of approaching ships. The fjords, those magnificent waterways carved by ancient glaciers, serve not only as natural harbors, but as the highways of the Norse world. What made this location so crucial? The western coast of Norway was the gateway to the broader North Atlantic, the pathway to Iceland, the British Isles, and beyond. Control these waters, and you control trade, wealth, and influence stretching from Dublin to Novgorod. The deep, sheltered fjords were perfect natural harbors for the legendary longships, allowing rapid deployment and safe haven in times of storm or conflict. Little did the inhabitants of Frey know that their island would soon witness a clash that would echo through the centuries, a battle that would help determine whether Norway would remain fractured or begin its journey toward unification under a single crown. The political landscape was equally turbulent. Following the death of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first king who had briefly united the realm, the kingdom had once again splintered. His son, Haakon the Good, educated in the court of King Athelstan in England, had returned with fresh ideas about governance and warfare. But the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe, Harald's eldest son who had been driven from the throne, were determined to reclaim what they saw as their birthright. As the morning fog lifts from the waters around Frey, tensions are reaching their breaking point. The conflict that will unfold here represents more than just a battle for territory. It is a collision between different visions for Norway's future, between traditional Viking values and new influences from the south, between brute force and strategic brilliance. The stage is set for the Battle of Rastarkalv, a confrontation that would demonstrate that in the Viking Age, victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the wisest. At the heart of our saga stands King Haakon the Good, also widely known as Haakon the Magnificent, a ruler whose story reads like something from legend, yet is firmly rooted in historical fact. The youngest son of Harald Fairhair, Haakon's path to the throne was anything but conventional. While his father had unified Norway through conquest and iron will, Haakon would need to rely on a different set of skills to maintain and expand that legacy. What truly set Haakon apart from other Norse rulers of his time was his unusual upbringing. As a child, he was sent to the court of King Athelstan in England, not as a hostage, as was sometimes the custom, but as a foster son to be educated in the ways of Anglo-Saxon governance. Picture a young Norse boy, raised among the stone churches and Latin manuscripts of Saxon England, absorbing ideas about kingship and military organization that were foreign to his homeland. When Haakon returned to Norway in his early 20s, he brought with him revolutionary concepts. The England he had known was a kingdom with centralized authority, written laws, and a growing Christian influence. These experiences shaped him into a ruler who valued strategy over brute force, diplomacy alongside strength. His men called him Haakon the Good, not merely as flattery, but in recognition of a leadership style that commanded respect rather than demanded it. Though raised in a Christian court, Haakon displayed remarkable political wisdom in his approach to religion. Unlike many converted rulers who forced their new faith upon their subjects, he recognized the deep roots of Norse traditions. He built churches but did not burn temples. He celebrated Christian festivals while still honoring the old gods during traditional blots or sacrificial feasts. This religious tolerance, almost unheard of in medieval Europe, earned him the loyalty of jarls who might otherwise have resisted his rule. In battle, Haakon was known to fight alongside his men rather than command from the rear. He carried a distinctive shield painted with a golden lion, a symbol perhaps influenced by his time in England, and wore a helmet that was said to gleam like the midnight sun. Stories tell that he could throw 2 spears at once with deadly accuracy, a skill he would need in the confrontation that awaited him on the shores of Frey. Opposing this remarkable king were the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe, men driven by a burning sense of rightful inheritance and the bitter taste of exile. Eirik himself had briefly ruled Norway after Harald Fairhair, but had earned his grim nickname through ruthless elimination of his rivals, including many of his own brothers. After Eirik's death in battle in the British Isles, his sons grew to manhood with one goal: to reclaim what they saw as their birthright. Leading this vengeful brotherhood was Gamle Eiriksson, the eldest and most determined of Eirik's sons. Where Haakon was known for his measured approach, Gamle was a man of fierce impulses and unbridled ambition. Standing taller than most men, with a red-gold beard that flowed to his chest, he cut an imposing figure at the prow of his dragon ship. Gamle had spent years building alliances with Danish nobles and gathering a formidable fighting force for the invasion of his ancestral homeland. Supporting Gamle were his brothers Guttorm, Harald, and Ranfred, each commanding their own warbands and ships. Guttorm, known for his skill with battle axe, had reportedly never lost a single combat. Harald, though younger, was said to possess his grandfather's gift for inspiring loyalty, even among hardened warriors. Ragnfred, perhaps the most cunning of the brothers, had a reputation for night raids and ambushes that left no survivors to tell the tale. Unlike Haakon, the sons of Eirik embraced the old ways without reservation. They sacrificed to Odin before battles and saw their campaign not merely as a political venture, but as a sacred duty to their father's memory. Their warriors wore wolf skins into battle and worked themselves into berserker rages with ritual dances on the eve of combat. What made this conflict particularly compelling was that both sides could claim legitimate right to rule. Both Haakon and the sons of Eirik were descendants of Harald Fairhair. Both had support from powerful jarls and chieftains. The question that would be answered at Rastarkalv was not just who would prevail through force of arms, but whose vision for Norway's future would endure. As dawn broke over the island of Frey that fateful morning, these two forces, representing not just rival claims to a throne, but competing ideas about what Norway might become, prepared to settle their differences in the ancient Norse way, through steel, courage, and the favor of the gods. At its heart, the Battle of Rastarkalv represents far more than a mere struggle for power between rival claimants to a throne. What unfolded on that windswept island in 955 was nothing less than a pivotal moment in the forging of Norwegian identity, a crucible in which competing visions for the future of a people would be tested and decided. The fundamental question hanging in the balance was deceptively simple. What kind of nation would Norway become? For nearly a generation, the lands that Harald Fairhair had briefly united had fragmented once again into competing interests. The dream of a unified Norway, one realm under one crown, seemed to be fading with each passing year. Yet both Haakon and the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe carried within them the belief that they were the rightful inheritors of Harald's vision. Though they differed dramatically in how that vision should be realized, this leads us to the first great tension underlying the battle, the clash between tradition and change. The Norway of old, was a patchwork of independent regions, where local jarls and chieftains held sway and paid allegiance to stronger leaders only when it suited their interests. The sons of Eirik embodied this older understanding of power: rule through strength, dominance through fear, and governance as a right of conquest. Did you know that Eirik Bloodaxe had earned his fearsome nickname by eliminating most of his brothers to secure his own claim to power? His sons were cut from the same cloth, believing that authority flowed naturally to those strong enough to seize and hold it. Their understanding of kingship was deeply rooted in ancient Norse traditions, where a ruler's worth was measured primarily by his prowess in battle and the wealth he could distribute to his loyal followers. Haakon, by contrast, represented something new. His years in England had exposed him to different concepts of governance, ideas about a king's responsibility to his people, about laws that applied even to the powerful, about the stability that comes from institutions rather than individuals. When he returned to Norway, he brought with him revolutionary innovations like the coastal defense system, known as the Lay Dang, which organized communities to contribute ships and men for national defense, rather than relying solely on a king's personal warband. There's a fascinating story about how Haakon once attended a traditional blot, a sacred feast, with animal sacrifice to the old gods, but made the sign of the cross over his drinking horn rather than dedicating it to Thor. This small act perfectly encapsulates the cultural tightrope he walked, honoring tradition while gradually introducing change. The second great tension swirling around Rastarkalv was the eternal conflict between loyalty and ambition. The jarls and chieftains of Norway faced difficult choices in deciding whom to support. Some remained loyal to the memory of Eirik Bloodaxe, having sworn oaths that they considered binding beyond his death. Others had grown to appreciate the stability and prosperity that Haakon's rule had brought, and still others saw in the conflict an opportunity to advance their own positions, carefully calculating which side offered the greatest advantage. Consider the position of Jarl Sigurd of Lade, one of Haakon's most important allies. As a powerful nobleman with his own substantial territories, he could have made a bid for power himself. Instead, he chose loyalty to Haakon's vision of a unified Norway. What motivated such loyalty in an age where ambition typically ruled supreme? Perhaps it was Haakon's willingness to share power rather than hoard it, to consult rather than command, a revolutionary approach in the Viking Age. The third crucial dynamic at play was the contest between strategy and brute force, a theme that would be dramatically illustrated on the battlefield itself. The sons of Eirik relied heavily on overwhelming force, bringing a fleet of 60 dragon ships filled with battle-hardened warriors to crush any resistance. Their approach to conflict was direct: amass superior numbers, strike hard and fast, and overpower the enemy through sheer ferocity. Haakon, however, understood warfare differently. His time in England had exposed him to more sophisticated military thinking. He recognized that victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the smartest. The battlefield itself would reveal whether the traditional Viking approach of overwhelming force would prevail against new tactical thinking. There's a telling detail preserved in the sagas. While the sons of Eirik allegedly sacrificed human captives to Odin before the battle, seeking the favor of the god of war, Haakon is said to have spent the night studying the terrain and positioning his forces for maximum advantage. This single contrast perfectly captures the competing worldviews that clashed on that fateful day. As the warriors on both sides prepared for battle, few understood that they were participating in something far larger than a dynastic dispute. The outcome at Rastarkalv would help determine whether Norway would continue along ancient paths or forge a new identity, whether it would remain a loose collection of regions or take further steps toward becoming a unified kingdom with a distinct national character. The swords and axes that clashed that day were carving out not just life and death for individual warriors, but the very shape of Norway's future. To truly understand the significance of Rastarkalv, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the farms, workshops and harbours of 10th century Norway. The popular image of Vikings as nothing more than bloodthirsty raiders has persisted for centuries. But this simplistic view couldn't be further from the truth. The Norway of King Haakon's time was a society in profound transformation, with a rich tapestry of daily life that might surprise you. Let's begin where most Norse people spent their days, not on longships, but on farms. The vast majority of people in 10th century Norway were farmers, working the narrow strips of fertile land between mountain and fjord. These weren't primitive subsistence farmers, but skilled agricultural innovators who had adapted to one of Europe's most challenging environments. Their farms typically consisted of a longhouse where the family lived, often with attached byres for animals during the harsh winter months. Imagine the daily routine on a typical Norse farm near Frey. The day would begin before dawn, with the women of the household kindling the central hearth fire while men headed out to tend to livestock. Children as young as 6 or 7 would have their own chores, gathering eggs, herding goats, or scaring birds away from the precious grain fields. The family might grow barley, oats and rye, supplementing their diet with cabbage, onions and peas from small garden plots. Here's something fascinating. Archaeological evidence from Norse farms shows sophisticated crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility and advanced irrigation techniques that maximized yields in a short growing season. These weren't simple slash-and-burn farmers, but agricultural specialists who carefully managed their land through generations. The rhythms of farm life shaped the Norse calendar and even their religious practices. Major festivals coincided with agricultural milestones: sowing in spring, midsummer growth, harvest in autumn, and midwinter survival. When men went off to battle, as they did at Rastarkalv, it was the women who ensured farms continued to function. These Norse women enjoyed rights that would have shocked their contemporaries elsewhere in Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and manage entire estates in their husband's absence. But Norwegian society extended far beyond its farms. The coastal communities that dotted the fjords were bustling centers of trade and craftsmanship. In towns like Kaupang and Trondheim, merchants gathered to exchange goods from across the known world. Norwegian traders were renowned for their business acumen, creating networks that stretched from Dublin to Constantinople. Contrary to their fearsome reputation, Norse merchants were often welcomed in foreign ports for their fair dealings and quality goods. They exported furs, walrus ivory, whetstones, and the highly prized Norwegian falcons used in royal hunts throughout Europe. In return, they brought back silver, fine textiles, wine, and exotic spices. The wealth on display at a Norse market town would have dazzled visitors. Arabic silver, Byzantine silks, and Frankish weapons changing hands amid a cacophony of different languages. At the heart of Norse success in both war and commerce was their mastery of shipbuilding and navigation. The sleek longships that struck fear into coastal communities were technological marvels of their age. Built without plans or written measurements, using only traditional knowledge passed from master to apprentice, these vessels combined shallow draft with remarkable seaworthiness. Norse navigators crossed the open Atlantic without compasses or charts. Relying instead on incredible observational skills, they tracked the sun's position using simple wooden discs, noted the flight patterns of birds, observed cloud formations, and memorized complex sailing directions passed down orally. Think about that achievement for a moment. These were men who could find their way from Norway to Iceland, a journey of over 800 miles across the open ocean, using methods so subtle and sophisticated that modern scholars are still trying to fully understand them. Behind all these achievements were the skilled hands of Norse craftspeople. Archaeological finds reveal astonishing workmanship across numerous trades. Blacksmiths who could forge swords with carbon steel edges so fine they could bend and spring back into shape. woodcarvers who transformed simple timber into intricate artwork, adorning ships and buildings, jewelry makers who crafted delicate silver filigree work that remains technically impressive even by today's standards. The social structure supporting this rich cultural tapestry was more complex than often portrayed. At the top stood the Jarls, noble families who traced their lineage back to legendary ancestors. Below them were the Carls, free farmers, merchants, and craftspeople who formed the backbone of society. They owned land, had the right to bear arms, and could speak at the Thing, the local assembly where disputes were settled and laws upheld. At the bottom of free society were the freedmen, former thralls, slaves, who had earned or been granted their liberty. While thraldom was certainly part of Norse society, it wasn't a permanent class status. Ambitious thralls could earn their freedom through loyal service or exceptional skills, and their children would be born free. This social mobility was one of the most distinctive features of Norse society. A successful merchant could rise to prominence regardless of birth, and a Jarl who failed to maintain his wealth and followers could see his status diminish. King Haakon himself recognized the importance of maintaining good relationships with prosperous farmers and merchants, not just with noble warriors. As the warriors gathered on both sides of the coming battle at Rastarkalv, they weren't just fighting for abstract power or personal glory. They were deciding the fate of this complex, vibrant society, a unique Norse way of life that balanced tradition with innovation, individual freedom with collective security, and fierce independence with the growing need for unified leadership in a changing world. Dawn was breaking over the Norwegian coast when the first lookouts spotted them. Dragon-headed prows emerging from the morning mist like apparitions from another world. 60 ships strong, their red and black sails billowing in the wind, the fleet of Eirik's sons had arrived with devastating suddenness. This was no mere raiding party, but a full-scale invasion force, carrying perhaps 2,000 warriors determined to overthrow King Haakon and claim what they saw as their birthright. The first phase of what would become the Battle of Rastarkalv began with this surprise arrival. Yet what the sons of Eirik didn't realize was that their surprise had already been compromised. Months earlier, Haakon had established a sophisticated network of coastal watchtowers, part of his innovative Leidang defense system. Each tower was staffed by loyal men who kept constant vigil, ready to light signal fires that could transmit warnings across vast distances in minutes rather than days. There's a wonderful story, preserved in the sagas, about a young shepherd boy named Eirik who was the first to spot the invasion fleet. Instead of running in terror, he raced to the nearest signal tower, arriving so out of breath he could barely speak. The watchmen, recognizing the gravity of his news, immediately lit their beacon. Within an hour, signal fires blazed across the headlands and hills, carrying the warning inland. The sons of Eirik had returned. This early warning gave Haakon something precious: time. Not much, but enough. The king had been staying at his royal estate just inland from Frey when the warning reached him. According to the Heimskringla, he was at table breaking his fast when his steward burst in with the news. Witnesses claim that Haakon showed no alarm, but calmly finished his meat and ale before standing to issue orders. This composure in crisis was characteristic of the king, and a stark contrast to the impulsive nature of his adversaries. "Send riders to Sigurd of Lade and Egil Ulsök," he commanded. "Tell them to bring every man who can hold a spear. We meet on the field at Rastarkalv before midday." Within hours, Haakon had gathered a force to meet the invaders, though one significantly smaller than the army arrayed against him. Some accounts suggest he had perhaps 800 warriors at most, facing an enemy more than twice that number. As night fell, the sons of Eirik made camp on the shoreline, confident in their superior numbers and certain of victory when battle would be joined the following day. But while they feasted and boasted of how they would divide Norway between them after their victory, Haakon was entering the second phase of the battle, the implementation of a brilliant strategy that would turn the invaders' confidence against them. Under cover of darkness, Haakon divided his forces into two groups, a dangerous move when already outnumbered, but one that revealed his strategic thinking. The main force he positioned behind the ridge at Rastarkalv, concealed from the shore. A smaller force, led by his trusted general Eirik Bloodaxe, he placed in a visible defensive position where they would be spotted immediately by the invaders come morning. Alongside this division of forces, Haakon made ingenious use of the terrain. The battlefield of Rastakov featured a gentle slope rising from the shore, with scattered stands of pine and birch providing cover. At the top of this slope stood several rock formations, natural obstacles that would channel any attacking force. Haakon positioned archers behind these rocks with clear fields of fire down the slope. There's a fascinating archaeological note here. Excavations in the 1970s discovered hundreds of arrowheads in precisely the locations where the sagas claimed Haakon's archers stood. Science has vindicated the accuracy of tales passed down orally for centuries before being written. Most cleverly, Haakon had his men drive wooden stakes into the ground along certain approaches to the ridge, concealed just beneath the surface of the long grass. These would be invisible to charging warriors, but would devastate the front lines of an attacking force. This adaptation of Roman defensive techniques was almost certainly something Haakon had learned during his time in England, a foreign innovation brought to Norse warfare. As the first light of dawn touched the slopes of Rastarkalv, the third and decisive phase of the battle began. From their beachhead, the sons of Eirik could see what appeared to be Haakon's full force, Egil's smaller contingent, arranged in a shield wall at the base of the ridge. Gamle Eiriksson, ever impetuous, saw what he believed was an opportunity to crush his uncle's forces in a single decisive charge. "Form the wedge," he ordered, arranging his warriors in the traditional Viking attack formation, a triangle of men with the most heavily armored at the point, designed to punch through enemy lines. As the rising sun glinted off their mail and helmets, Gamle raised his famous axe, said to be so heavy that no other man could wield it, and gave the signal to advance. With roars that echoed across the water, the sons of Eirik led their forces up the slope toward Egil's seemingly outnumbered men. The ground thundered with the impact of thousands of feet as they charged. Egil's men braced, shields locked, spears leveled, appearing to prepare for a desperate last stand. What happened next became legendary in Norse military history. As the charging force reached the midpoint of the slope, Haakon sprung his trap. From their concealed position behind the ridge, his main force suddenly appeared, charging down the slope to strike the invaders' exposed right flank. Simultaneously, archers rose from their hidden positions among the rocks, loosing clouds of arrows into the left flank of the attackers. The sons of Eirik found themselves caught in a perfect ambush, a classic hammer and anvil maneuver. Their forward momentum carried them into Egil's braced shield wall, while Haakon's fresh troops slammed into their flank. Confusion turned to panic as warriors realized they were surrounded on three sides. In the chaos, Gamle Eiriksson fought like a man possessed, his great axe rising and falling in deadly arcs. The sagas tell us he cut down 12 men before reaching Eirik Bloodaxe himself. Their duel was brief but terrible, ending with Egil fatally wounded, but managing with his last strength to deliver a sword thrust that pierced Gamle's mail. With their leader fallen, the invading force began to fragment. Haakon, recognizing the crucial moment, personally led a push toward the center of the enemy formation, his golden lion shield visible to all, rallying his men. "Forward for Norway," he allegedly cried, perhaps the first recorded use of the concept of fighting for the nation rather than merely for a leader. The remaining sons of Eirik, seeing the tide turn decisively against them, fought their way back to the shore and their ships. The retreat quickly became a rout, with Haakon's men in pursuit all the way to the water's edge. Many of the invaders never reached their vessels, cut down in the shallows or drowned in armor trying to swim to safety. By midday, it was over. The shore at Rastarkalv ran red, and nearly 40 of the invaders' 60 ships were captured or destroyed. Haakon had won a victory so complete that it would secure his rule for years to come, not through superior numbers or even greater valor, but through intelligence, preparation, and tactical brilliance that was centuries ahead of its time. As the king surveyed the battlefield, he ordered care for the wounded, friend and foe alike, another practice unusual for the era. Looking out at the remaining enemy ships disappearing over the horizon, he is said to have remarked, "They will return, but now they know that Norway is defended not just by strong arms, but by strong minds." He was right. The sons of Eirik would try again. But the Battle of Rastarkalv had demonstrated that a new kind of leadership had taken root in Norway, one that would ultimately transform a collection of warring regions into a united kingdom. Long after the blood had dried on the fields of Rastarkalv and the fallen warriors had journeyed to their final rest, something remarkable happened. The battle, rather than fading into obscurity like countless other Viking Age conflicts, took on a life of its own in the cultural memory of the Norse people. Through this preservation, we gain a fascinating window not just into the events themselves, but into the values, beliefs, and intellectual traditions that shaped Norse civilization. Central to understanding the battle's significance is the Norse concept of honor in combat. For the warriors who fought at Rastarkalv, battle was not merely a means to an end, but a sacred arena where one's true worth was revealed. The Norse did not fear death in battle. Indeed, they welcomed it, believing that to fall with weapon in hand was the surest path to Valhalla, Odin's Hall of Heroes. This belief transformed warfare from a grim necessity into a form of spiritual expression. There's a telling moment recorded in the saga accounts of Rastarkalv. When King Haakon saw that victory was assured, he supposedly ordered his men to offer quarter to any enemy warriors who threw down their weapons. Yet many of the sons of Eirik's followers chose death over surrender. One veteran warrior, when cornered against the shoreline, allegedly laughed in the face of his opponents, crying out, "No man shall ever say that Thorolf Skjalgi begged for mercy," before hurling himself against 6 of Haakon's men. Such behavior might seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, but it perfectly encapsulates the Norse warrior ethos. A good death was preferable to a life without honor. The sagas name numerous warriors from both sides who distinguished themselves through acts of exceptional courage at Rastarkalv. Their names remembered not because they survived, but because they embodied the ideal of the perfect warrior. The battle also showcases the sophisticated military tactics that made the Norse such formidable fighters throughout Europe. While popular imagination often depicts Viking warfare as chaotic berserker charges, the reality was far more disciplined and organized. At Rastarkalv, both sides employed complex formations that required extensive training and coordination. The shield wall, where warriors would interlock their shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier, was the backbone of Norse field combat. Maintaining this formation while advancing uphill, as Eirik's sons' forces attempted to do, required extraordinary discipline. Meanwhile, Haakon's flanking maneuver demonstrated an understanding of battlefield geometry that would have impressed military theorists of any era. What's particularly fascinating is how Haakon combined traditional Norse tactics with innovations he had observed during his time in England. The use of terrain features as force multipliers, the positioning of archers to create interlocking fields of fire, and the hidden stake defenses all show the influence of Anglo-Saxon and perhaps even remembered Roman military practices. Rastarkalv thus represents a pivotal moment of cultural exchange, where foreign ideas were adapted to Norse conditions. Perhaps the most enduring cultural element of Rastarkalv, however, was how the battle was remembered and transmitted to future generations. Here, we must appreciate the crucial role of the skalds, the poet-historians who preserved Norse history through complex, metrically sophisticated verses. During the battle itself, King Haakon reportedly had 3 skalds positioned on a nearby hilltop, safely removed from the fighting, but with a clear view of events. Their task was not just to observe, but to compose verses on the spot, crafting the first draft of history even as it unfolded before them. The most famous of these battle skalds was Eyvind Skaldaspillir, whose verses on Rastakalv were so powerful that they were still being recited verbatim over 200 years later when the sagas were first written down. The skaldic tradition was a remarkable intellectual achievement. These weren't simple rhymes, but intricate compositions following strict rules of alliteration, internal rhyme, and metaphorical language. Skalds used specialized poetic vocabulary and complex kennings, figurative expressions where, for instance, a sword might be called the fire of battle, or a warrior the feeder of ravens. This formalized structure made skaldic verses resistant to change over time. The complex patterns served as a mnemonic device, ensuring accuracy in an oral culture. Think about that for a moment. Without writing, without recording devices, the Norse were able to preserve detailed accounts of battles like Rastakalv across generations through the power of poetry alone. This was history as performance art, a living tradition that connected each new generation with their ancestors' achievements. These skaldic verses eventually became incorporated into the written sagas, the prose histories that form our richest source of information about Viking Age Scandinavia. The Battle of Rastarkalv is preserved in particular detail in the Heimskringla's Saga of Haakon the Good, compiled by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson around 1230. Though writing over 2 centuries after the events, Snorri drew on an unbroken chain of oral tradition, incorporating the verses of Eyvind and other contemporary skalds into his narrative. The historical value of these accounts has been dramatically confirmed by modern archaeology. When excavations were conducted at Rastakalv in the 1970s, archaeologists discovered artifacts exactly where the saga described them. Arrowheads clustered behind rock formations where Haakon positioned his archers, shield bosses and sword fragments along the line of the main clash, and even the remains of the stakes that Haakon had his men plant as defensive measures. Most remarkably, the field of Rastakalv itself remains almost unchanged from the day of the battle over 1,000 years ago. Visitors today can stand on the same ridge where Haakon concealed his main force, look down the same slope that Gamle Eiriksson charged up with his men, and see the same shoreline where the surviving invaders fled to their ships. Few battlefields anywhere in the world retain such a direct connection to their past. The tactical innovations displayed at Rastakalv had a lasting influence far beyond Norway. Haakon's use of terrain, hidden reserves and flanking maneuvers was studied by later military leaders throughout northern Europe. Some historians have even suggested that the Norman tactics at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, particularly the famous feigned retreat that drew the Anglo-Saxon forces out of formation, show the influence of strategies first employed at Rastakalv over a century earlier. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Rastakalv is how it demonstrates the sophistication of Norse intellectual culture. Far from the stereotype of mindless raiders, the Norse created complex systems for preserving knowledge, reflecting on their own society, and adapting to changing circumstances. The battle and its commemoration stand as a testament to a people who valued not just the sword, but also the word, who understood that true immortality comes not merely through victory, but through the stories we tell about ourselves. The Battle of Rastarkalv didn't unfold in isolation. Like ripples in a fjord, the events at Frey were shaped by currents flowing from far beyond Norway's rugged shores. This decisive clash between King Haakon and the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe reveals a fascinating web of external influences that transformed not just this battle, but the very nature of Norse society. Imagine standing aboard a merchant ship approaching the Norwegian coast in the year 955. The Norway you'd witness was not the isolated realm of popular imagination, but a land deeply connected to the wider world through a complex network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And nowhere were these external influences more evident than in the battle strategies employed at Rastarkalv. Perhaps the most profound external impact came through King Haakon himself. Remember that as a young prince, Haakon had spent his formative years in the court of King Athelstan of England. This wasn't just a diplomatic visit, it was an immersion in a radically different military tradition. Anglo-Saxon England had preserved many elements of Roman military science, combined with their own innovations in battlefield tactics. While his cousins were learning traditional Norse combat in the fjords of Norway, young Haakon was absorbing sophisticated Anglo-Saxon approaches to warfare that emphasized discipline, formation, and strategic planning over individual heroics. There's a wonderful detail preserved in the Heimskringla about Haakon's forces at Rastarkalv. The saga describes how his men advanced, shield to shield, spear tips aligned like the teeth of a great comb. This precise formation discipline was distinctly un-Viking. It reflected the influence of Saxon shield wall tactics that Haakon had witnessed firsthand in England. The traditional Norse approach favored the wedge formation that the sons of Eirik employed, powerful for breaking enemy lines but vulnerable to flanking. Haakon's adoption of the more flexible Saxon approach gave him tactical options his opponents couldn't anticipate. Even more revolutionary was Haakon's use of terrain. Traditional Norse battles often took place on flat, open ground. The famous hazelled fields, where boundaries were marked with hazel branches and combat, was almost ritualistic in nature. But at Rastarkalv, Haakon employed what military historians now recognize as classic Roman-inspired battlefield engineering, using natural features to channel enemy forces, positioning troops on high ground, and establishing killing zones where his archers could rain death upon attackers struggling uphill. Did you know that archaeologists have found remains of what appear to be deliberately placed obstacles, hidden stakes and ditches, on the Rastarkalv battlefield? These sophisticated defensive works have no precedent in traditional Norse warfare, but bear striking resemblance to field fortifications described in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. This represents a direct transfer of military technology across cultural boundaries, knowledge Haakon brought back from England and adapted to Norse conditions. But England's influence extended beyond mere tactics. During his stay with Athelstan, Haakon had observed a different model of kingship, one where a ruler's legitimacy came not just from strength in battle, but from a recognized responsibility to defend the entire realm. This concept informed his revolutionary Leidang system, the coastal defense network that provided early warning of the sons of Eirik's invasion. The Leidang represented a fundamental shift in how Norse society approached warfare, transforming it from the private enterprise of warlords and their followings into a communal responsibility. There's a telling moment recounted in the sagas when, on the eve of battle, Haakon addressed his men not as my warriors, but as defenders of Norway. This subtle shift in language reveals the profound influence of Anglo-Saxon concepts of nationhood and shared identity that were still revolutionary in Scandinavia. The battle also highlights the crucial importance of regional alliances in Norse politics. Norway in the 10th century wasn't a unified kingdom in the modern sense, but rather a patchwork of regions dominated by powerful jarls and chieftains. Success in conflict depended not just on personal strength, but on the web of alliances a leader could weave. Haakon's victory at Rastarkalv would have been impossible without the support of key regional powers, particularly Jarl Sigurd of Lade. Controlling the wealthy Trøndelag region, Sigurd could have been a rival claimant to power himself. Instead, he became Haakon's most crucial ally, bringing his considerable forces to support the king at Rastarkalv. The sagas tell us that when Sigurd arrived with his men, he carried a distinctive banner showing a raven, the symbol of his house. but beneath it flew Haakon's golden lion. This visual representation of their alliance spoke volumes about Haakon's diplomatic skill. What made such alliances possible? In large part, it was Haakon's willingness to respect regional autonomy while providing the benefits of central coordination. Unlike his father, Harald Fairhair, who had imposed royal authority through conquest, Haakon offered local leaders a partnership. In return for their support, they maintained significant independence in their home territories while gaining the advantages of mutual defense and increased trade opportunities. This brings us to another crucial external factor, the vital importance of trade routes. Norway's western coast wasn't just a battlefield, it was one of Europe's most strategic commercial corridors. Control of the sea lanes along this coast meant control of the wealth flowing between the British Isles, continental Europe, and the Norse settlements in the North Atlantic. For the jarls and chieftains of coastal Norway, supporting the right king wasn't just a matter of honor, but of economic self-interest. The region around Frey, where the Battle of Rastarkalv took place, was particularly significant for trade. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of extensive commercial activity in the area: imported pottery from the Rhineland, glass beads from the Eastern Mediterranean, and even coins from the Islamic caliphates. This wasn't some remote backwater, but a key node in an international trading network that stretched from Ireland to the Silk Road. Haakon's time in England had taught him the value of stable trade for royal power. Under his rule, merchant ships received royal protection, market towns flourished, and Norway became increasingly integrated into European commercial networks. The sons of Eirik, by contrast, represented the older raiding tradition that disrupted the very trade networks from which the coastal regions profited. Is it any wonder that many coastal jarls chose to support Haakon? There's a fascinating account preserved in the Chronicle of John of Wallingford that mentions Norwegian merchants in York describing Haakon as a king who guards the sea roads rather than plundering them. This reputation for providing security rather than threat represented a profound shift in how Norse rulers were perceived abroad, and it directly translated into prosperity at home. Finally, we cannot understand Rastarkalv without considering the complex relations between the Nordic kingdoms themselves. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were not yet the clearly defined nations we know today. Their boundaries were fluid, their royal houses intermarried, and they frequently intervened in each other's internal conflicts. The sons of Eirik hadn't built their invasion force in isolation. They had spent years in Denmark, gathering support from King Harald Bluetooth, who provided them with ships, men, and material support. Why would the Danish king invest so heavily in this Norwegian civil conflict? The answer lies in regional power politics. A strong, unified Norway under Haakon posed a potential threat to Danish ambitions in the North Sea region. By supporting the sons of Eirik, who would likely rule as Danish clients if successful, Harald Bluetooth was pursuing a classic strategy of installing friendly rulers on his borders. Archaeological evidence supports this Danish connection. Among the weapons recovered from the Rastarkalv battlefield are distinctively Danish axe heads and sword hilts, tangible evidence of foreign involvement in what might otherwise seem a purely internal Norwegian struggle. The battle holds another fascinating Danish connection that the sagas only hint at. Among Haakon's most trusted commanders was a warrior named Thorkel the Tall, described as a man who had sailed with the Jomsvikings. The Jomsvikings were an elite mercenary brotherhood based at the fortress of Jomsborg in what is now Poland, fighters who sold their exceptional military skills to the highest bidder. Their presence in Haakon's forces suggests he was drawing not just on Norwegian resources, but on specialized military expertise from throughout the Baltic region. What makes the external dimensions of Rastarkalv so significant is how they reveal the complex interconnectedness of the Viking world. This wasn't a simple clash between local warlords, but a sophisticated conflict shaped by international diplomacy, economic interests, cultural exchange, and strategic thinking that spanned the North Sea world. When the dust settled on the field at Rastarkalv and the victorious Haakon surveyed the fallen, perhaps he reflected on how his years abroad had prepared him for this moment. The battle wasn't won through traditional Norse valor alone, but through a synthesis of native strength with foreign knowledge, a powerful combination that would shape Norway's development for generations to come. The Norway that emerged from Rastarkalv was not an isolated kingdom, but one increasingly connected to the wider European world, through trade, through diplomacy, and through the exchange of ideas. The blood-soaked field at Frey marked not just a victory for King Haakon, but a decisive step in Norway's transformation from a collection of fiercely independent regions into a nation ready to take its place on the medieval European stage. The echoes of swords clashing at Rastakov had barely faded when Norway began to experience the profound impact of Haakon's victory. This wasn't just another battle won. It was a turning point that would shape Scandinavian history for centuries to come. In the immediate aftermath, Haakon's triumph brought something the Norwegian people had rarely known: stability. For the first time in generations, farmers could plant their crops without fear of raids. Merchants could travel the coastal routes without constantly looking over their shoulders, and communities could focus on building rather than defending. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. A farmer near Bergen could now trade his grain surplus with a craftsman in Trondheim, without worrying about whether rival chieftains would seize his goods. Shipbuilders could invest time in developing better vessels for trade rather than just war. The peace dividend, as we might call it today, was enormous, but Haakon's most lasting achievement wasn't just in winning the battle, it was in how he used his victory. Unlike many successful warriors who might have embarked on a campaign of revenge against those who had opposed him, Haakon chose a different path. He offered reconciliation to the defeated, integrated former enemies into his government, and focused on building institutions that would outlast him. There's a wonderful story about how, in the years following Rastakov, Haakon established Norway's first formal legal code. When asked why a victorious king would limit his own power with laws, he allegedly replied, "A kingdom ruled by laws will outlast a kingdom ruled by spears." This philosophy, that sustainable power comes from good governance rather than mere force, was revolutionary for its time. The prosperity that followed Rastakov was remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows a boom in urban development, with new trading centers springing up along the coast. Norwegian ships began appearing more frequently in foreign ports as merchants rather than raiders. The silver hoards found from this period suggest a significant increase in wealth and international trade. Perhaps most significantly, Rastarkalv changed how future Norse leaders thought about power. The battle demonstrated that superior strategy could overcome superior numbers, that preparation and intelligence were as important as raw courage. Future kings of Norway would study accounts of how Haakon had turned disadvantage into victory, learning that leadership required more than just strength of arm. As our journey through this remarkable story comes to an end, we're left with a profound appreciation for how single events can change the course of history. The Battle of Rastarkalv wasn't just about who would rule Norway, it was about what kind of rule would prevail. The victory of wisdom over force, of strategy over strength, set a standard that would influence Scandinavian leadership for generations to come. If you've been captivated by this epic Viking battle, don't keep this historical treasure to yourself. Share it with your friends who love a good story of strategy and courage. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives and ring that bell to join us on more adventures through medieval history. Every like and share helps us bring more of these fascinating stories to light. Until our next historical journey together, this is the Medieval Archives, where the past comes alive. See you in our next video.